At 2 a.m., on a cold stretch of sand in Long Island, 4 men stepped out of the Atlantic surf in German uniforms, carrying explosives, cash, and a mission meant to set America on fire from the inside. But the most dangerous weapon they brought ashore was not in their bags. It was sitting in the chest of their leader. A decision already made. A betrayal already loaded like a round in the chamber, waiting for the right moment to be fired. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want more World War II stories told like a live operation, with the human mistakes, the hidden orders, and the consequences that changed everything.
The plan was called Operation Pastorius, and it was Germany's bold attempt to bring sabotage to the American homeland at the moment when the United States was mobilizing at a scale the world had never seen. In Berlin, the logic sounded clean. American factories were pumping out aircraft, ammunition, ships, and tanks. American rail lines were moving coal, steel, and troops across a continent. If you could damage the industrial bloodstream, you could slow the war machine. If you could make Americans feel unsafe on their own soil, you could force resources to be wasted on defense and internal security. A handful of saboteurs, trained and inserted quietly, could do what bombs and submarines could not.
But Berlin forgot the oldest rule of clandestine war. You can train a man to plant explosives. You can train him to forge papers. You can train him to vanish into a crowd. But you cannot train him to be loyal if his heart is already turning. The man at the center of the coming collapse was George John Dash. He was not a cinematic mastermind in a leather coat. He was not a mysterious shadow. He was a complicated, restless man with a history that did not fit neatly into Nazi mythology. He had lived in the United States before the war. He knew American streets, American habits, American confidence. He also knew something else: how large America was, how hard it was to truly hide in it, and how quickly a small operation could unravel if even one link snapped. German intelligence, the Abwehr, picked its men carefully, but it also picked them under pressure. The Reich was fighting on multiple fronts. Resources were stretched. Rivalries poisoned decision-making. The Abwehr needed results, and it needed them fast. So it took men who had lived abroad, men who spoke English, men who could blend in, and it assumed that training and discipline would overcome the messy unpredictability of human motives. The saboteurs trained in Germany, at a special facility designed to turn civilians into weapons. They learned how to make explosives look like ordinary objects. They learned how to ignite time-delayed devices. They learned how to destroy transformers, derail trains, cripple aluminum plants, cut bridges, and burn warehouses. They memorized target lists. They practiced in darkness. They rehearsed what to say if questioned. They were given American money, fake documents, and instructions to melt into the population. Their targets were not random. They aimed for the arteries, aluminum production, hydroelectric power, rail nodes, canal systems, major industrial hubs. If they could spark chaos, even temporarily, it would be a psychological victory as much as a material one.
The operation was split into 2 teams. One team would land on Long Island, near New York, the economic heartbeat of the country. The other would land in Florida, where the coastline offered access and the southern rail line stretched north like veins. 2 landings. 8 men. A synchronized campaign of sabotage. The expectation in Berlin was that these men would operate for months, perhaps longer, striking targets and disappearing before the Americans could even understand what was happening. On the night of June 12, 1942, the first team approached the American coast by submarine. The sea was black. The air smelled of salt and oil. The men wore German naval uniforms for a reason that was both practical and psychological. If they were intercepted at sea, wearing military uniform could, in theory, frame them as combatants rather than spies. It was a thin legal distinction, but in wartime, thin distinctions could become life or death. The submarine surfaced near Amagansett, Long Island. A rubber boat slipped into the water. 4 men climbed in with crates of explosives and supplies. The surf slapped against the boat. The sand waited. When they reached shore, they dragged their equipment onto the beach and began to bury it quickly, methodically, like men who had drilled the motions 100 times. The leader, Dash, was in charge. With him was Ernest Peter Berger, a man with his own complicated past and his own reasons for hating Nazis more than he feared them. Also with them were Heinrich Heink and Richard Quirin, men who believed the mission, followed orders, and did not understand that the operation was already sick at its core. Then the night cracked open. A figure appeared on the beach. A young Coast Guard patrolman named John Cullen. He was doing what thousands of men did on American coasts every night after Pearl Harbor. Walking, listening, watching. When he saw the shapes on the sand, he moved closer. He called out. He asked what they were doing. For a fraction of a second, the operation hung on a knife edge. For saboteurs, fresh from the sea, caught in the open, with equipment on the sand and no clean story that could survive scrutiny. There are moments in clandestine operations when the outcome is decided by one voice, one tone, one blink. This was one of them. Dash stepped forward. He spoke English. He tried to control the situation. He invented a story about being fishermen. It was weak. Cullen was not convinced. The patrolman's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The uniforms were wrong. The equipment was wrong. The way the men stood was wrong. Dash made a fast choice. He did not shoot Cullen. He did not attempt to kill the witness. Instead, he bribed him. He pulled out cash and pressed it into Cullen's hands, trying to buy time, trying to make the patrolman walk away. Cullen took the money, but he did not leave the beach to forget it. He left the beach to raise the alarm. Cullen ran. He reached his station. He reported what he had seen. The Coast Guard mobilized. The search began. When armed men returned to the beach, the saboteurs were gone, but they found what the saboteurs could not erase. Traces in the sand, disturbed ground, signs of buried crates. The investigation turned urgent immediately. Something had landed. Something had been hidden. The coast had been penetrated. Meanwhile, Dash and his men did what they had rehearsed. They changed out of uniforms and into civilian clothes. They moved inland. They separated. They headed for New York, the city where a man could vanish if he knew how to disappear into crowds and schedules. The plan was to regroup, retrieve the buried equipment later, then begin the sabotage campaign. On paper, it was still alive. But inside Dash, something else was happening. The encounter with Cullen was not just an operational complication. It was a shock that forced reality into focus. If a single patrolman could appear in the dark at the wrong time, then everything could collapse at any moment. The American coastline was not empty. The American security services were alert. The net was not perfect, but it was tightening, and it was tightening fast. Dash had not come to America to die for Hitler. He had a different plan, and now he began to execute it. Within days of landing, before the sabotage campaign even began, Dash made his move. He traveled to New York City and walked into the most dangerous place for a man like him, the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But he did not walk in like a captured criminal. He tried to walk in like a man offering a prize. At first, it did not go smoothly. He called the FBI. He tried to speak to someone important. He dropped hints. He expected dramatic recognition. Instead, he met skepticism, routine, the friction of a large organization that had heard rumors and hoaxes and false confessions before. Dash grew frustrated. He needed to force the FBI to understand that he was not bluffing. So he did something that turned the lock. He showed them money. He presented a large sum of cash, part of the operation's funding, as proof. He offered names. He offered details. He offered the location of the buried explosives on Long Island. He offered the targets. He offered the timing. He offered the structure of the operation. In other words, he offered the entire network, not slowly, not partially, but as a complete package, because he understood something crucial. Once the FBI believed him, the clock would start, and the FBI would move with the full force of a country at war. This was the moment the German operation effectively died. Because once an infiltrator reveals the names, the routes, the safe houses, the method, and the objectives, the infiltrator is not merely betraying a mission. He is detonating it. The FBI, now convinced it had a real case, moved rapidly. Agents spread out. They coordinated with the Coast Guard and the military. They traced the saboteurs' movements. They watched train stations. They checked hotels. They monitored communications. They pulled every lever a wartime government could pull. And the arrests began. The first team, the Long Island Group, had barely settled into the illusion of safety when the net snapped shut. One by one, the men were located and detained. The operation had not even fired its first shot, and already it was collapsing under the weight of one man's confession. Then the FBI turned toward the second team. While Dash Group had landed on Long Island, a second submarine had delivered 4 more men to Florida. Edward Curling, Herman Neubauer, Werner Thiel, and Herbert Haupt. They carried the same mission, the same explosives, the same confidence that America could be struck from within. They believed they were one half of a larger effort. They did not know that the other half had already been betrayed. For a brief moment, they moved as if the plan still existed. They traveled. They blended. They tried to take positions that would allow sabotage across rail lines and factories. But clandestine work depends on silence, and silence was gone. The FBI, armed with details, hunted them down. The second team was captured as well. In a matter of weeks, Operation Pastorius, which had been designed to last months and spread fear across the United States, was ended so completely that its sabotage list remained mostly theoretical. Bridges did not collapse. Aluminum plants did not burn. Rail hubs did not erupt. The operation died in its infancy, not because American security was perfect, but because one of the saboteurs decided the mission was already doomed, and he chose to trade loyalty for survival. Yet even after the arrests, the story did not end. In fact, the most politically explosive chapter was just beginning, because the United States government now faced a question with enormous consequences. How do you try men who arrived by submarine to destroy American infrastructure? Are they common criminals? Are they prisoners of war? Are they spies? Are they unlawful combatants? And what message do you send to any future saboteurs watching from abroad? President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted certainty and speed. A public civilian trial risked delays, appeals, and legal complexities. Roosevelt chose a military commission, a special tribunal designed to act quickly in wartime. The men would be tried not in open court as ordinary criminals, but as enemy agents acting outside the laws of war. It was a hard, dramatic decision, and it immediately raised legal questions, because the United States had deep traditions of civilian courts and constitutional protections. But wartime compresses values into decisions that feel like emergencies, and Roosevelt treated this as an emergency. These men had not merely crossed borders. They had crossed oceans. They had carried explosives with the intention of mass destruction. The government wanted them removed from the board as fast as possible. The trial became one of the most famous wartime legal battles in American history. The defendants argued that they should be tried in civilian court. The government argued that their mission placed them under the jurisdiction of a military commission. The case rose rapidly through the system, and it reached the United States Supreme Court. The court, in a landmark decision, sided with the government's authority to use the military commission for unlawful enemy combatants in this context. Behind the legal language, the reality was brutal. The outcome was heading toward execution. 6 of the 8 men were sentenced to death and executed. The 2 exceptions were Dash and Berger, the men who had betrayed the mission and assisted the FBI. Their cooperation spared them from the chair, but it did not give them freedom. They were sentenced to long prison terms, held during the war, and later deported. If you stop here, the story sounds simple. A saboteur confessed, the FBI arrested everyone, justice followed. But the deeper reality is more unsettling, because it reveals how fragile clandestine operations can be, and how much they depend on the psychology of the people carrying them. Operation Pastorius was not defeated by a brilliant counterintelligence trick. It was defeated by internal contradiction. Germany needed saboteurs who could blend into American life, so it recruited men who had lived in America. But men who had lived in America carried something Germany could not control: familiarity, attachment, and a sense of what America really was. Dash was not stepping into a foreign world. He was stepping back into a world he knew, and that made it harder to view the mission as an abstract duty. It made it personal. It also exposed another failure. The Abwehr assumed that ideological pressure and training could create obedience. But obedience in clandestine warfare is not built only with training. It is built with trust, and trust in Nazi Germany was poisoned by fear. Even inside German intelligence, rivalries and suspicion weakened cohesion. A saboteur who begins to doubt his handlers has no stable foundation. Once doubt appears, fear follows. Once fear follows, betrayal becomes an option. Dash also miscalculated something in his attempt to defect. He believed that turning himself in would make him valuable. He believed he could control the narrative, that he would be rewarded, that he would be treated as a hero who prevented sabotage. Instead, he discovered a harsh truth. In wartime, governments do not celebrate men who arrive with enemy explosives, even if those men claim they change their minds. They use them, they interrogate them, and then they lock them away. Still, from the American perspective, the confession was priceless. It prevented sabotage. It sent a message to German intelligence that the United States was alert. It demonstrated that infiltration was possible, but sustaining infiltration was far harder than planning it. It also gave American security services a public victory at a time when morale mattered. In 1942, the United States was still absorbing shock after shock across the Pacific and in the early stages of fighting in Europe and North Africa. A story of enemy agents being captured on American soil became proof that the homeland could defend itself. But there was also a shadow beneath the victory, because the case reminded Americans that the ocean was not a wall. Submarines could reach the coast. Men could land. Crates could be buried. If one patrolman had not encountered that team on the beach, the saboteurs might have retrieved their explosives quietly and disappeared into the country. Even with Dash's betrayal, the operation proved that the concept was not fantasy. It was feasible. It simply failed due to the human factor. Think about the timeline. A submarine crosses the Atlantic. 4 men land under cover of night. They bury explosives on American soil. They reach New York City. For several days, they move inside the United States as free men. During those days, the difference between sabotage and safety is not a fortress. It is not a wall. It is a single decision inside a single mind. That is what makes this story so powerful. It is not only about German sabotage plans. It is about the nature of intelligence itself. How nations build grand designs and then place them into the hands of individuals who can change everything with a moment of fear, ego, regret, or ambition. The Coast Guard patrolman, John Cullen, also becomes part of the story's meaning. He was not a famous commander. He was not a general. He was not a strategist. He was a young man walking a dark shoreline, doing a routine duty. He made a routine report. His alertness triggered the immediate search that found buried evidence. That evidence helped confirm Dash's story. The gears turned faster because one ordinary man acted like the war mattered. In Berlin, no one could have predicted that. Intelligence operations often fail not because of brilliant enemy minds, but because reality is messy. A random patrol happens to walk at the wrong time. A nervous leader chooses bribery instead of silence. A defector misjudges how he will be treated. A government chooses a legal path that becomes a historic precedent. And in the middle of it all, the operation collapses in a way that feels sudden, almost unreal. This is why the phrase "the network fell in one night" is not an exaggeration of the spirit of what happened. The operational death occurred the moment Dash decided to go to the FBI and speak. From that moment, the mission was no longer a mission. It was evidence. Every target list became a confession. Every safe plan became a trap. Every man became a name in an agent's notebook. If the Abwehr had achieved even a fraction of its sabotage goals, the psychological impact might have been enormous. Imagine a transformer station destroyed near a major city, causing blackouts. Imagine a factory fire in a war production center. Imagine a rail bridge sabotaged, derailing coal shipments. These attacks would not have ended the war, but they would have created fear and distraction. They might have forced resources into internal defense. They might have sparked political pressure. In wartime, even small disruptions can ripple outward. Instead, the ripples went the other way. The Germans lost 8 trained men, lost equipment, lost credibility, and gained nothing but a cautionary tale. Their attempt to strike America became proof of how vulnerable infiltration was to betrayal. For the men captured, the consequences were absolute. The tribunal moved quickly. Interrogations were intense. Details of training and instructions were dragged into the light. The idea of the saboteur, the hidden enemy, became part of wartime imagination. 6 men died. 2 lived but paid with years and exile. For the United States, the case reinforced a new reality. Modern war was not only about ships and planes. It was about intelligence, deception, internal security, and law. The Supreme Court decision affirmed a wartime power that would echo long after 1945. Even after victory, the legal and moral questions of that tribunal would remain. And for Dash, the man who triggered the collapse, the story ends not with triumph but with a strange emptiness. He avoided execution, but he did not become a hero. He was seen by Germany as a traitor, by America as an enemy agent, and by history as the man whose confession prevented sabotage but also exposed how little control he had over the consequences of his own betrayal. He gambled with his life, and he survived, but survival did not mean victory. If you zoom out, the most terrifying lesson for any intelligence service is not that the enemy can detect you. It is that your own people can destroy you. You can build an operation with submarines, explosives, forged identities, and months of planning, and then one man can walk into an office, speak into a telephone, and wipe it all away. That is what happened here. A German operation meant to shock America ended before it began, because one German saboteur chose to reveal everything. The network did not merely fail. It collapsed so completely that its very existence became a warning sign to everyone who would ever try the same thing again. And that is why this story is not just a footnote of World War II. It is a perfect demonstration of how wars can turn on small human moments, and how the most secret operations in the world can be defeated not by firepower, but by a confession made in a quiet room, in a city where millions of people walked past without knowing that, for a brief moment, the outcome of a German plan rested on whether one man would stay silent or speak.